Rana Mita is Professor of History and Politics of Modern China at University of Oxford, at the Institute of Chinese Studies in the University of Oxford. Thank you very much for speaking with us today. From what I understand, a lot of your work has been to do or focused on the Republic era in China, at the end of the Qing dynasty to the time of the communist takeover in that sense. What we want to get a sense of is what about the history in that period showed up the DNA of the Chinese culture, which we can realistically expect to play out even as China deals with a lot of changes taking place today. Perhaps maybe you can just give us a sense of the work that you've done in that era, and then we'll take the conversation from there.
For a very long time, a lot of people associated modern China essentially with the era of Chairman Mao, a kind of very radical, anti-imperialist, new type of Chinese politics. And for a generation of people observing China from the outside, it was the China of Mao that really set the pace. This was people wearing identical sorts of suits, chanting slogans, the Cultural Revolution, all of that. That era is now really long since past. It's decades in the past. And for those who can take a longer historical perspective, it does seem that a lot of the questions that are being asked in contemporary Chinese politics and by contemporary Chinese society don't actually relate very much to the questions that were being asked under Mao, but do relate a lot more to the sort of questions that were being asked in the 1920s and 1930s during China's so-called Republican era. Now, this is something that maybe comes as a surprise to those who haven't spent much time looking at early 20th century Chinese history. There's often been a rather careless assumption that before 1949, before the so-called liberation of China under the communists, all of Chinese history was a rather dark, sometimes called feudal past.
So are you suggesting that the Mao era was an aberration rather than a defining...
It's one way of looking at it. Aberration may be a little strong because actually, of course, Mao's revolution, the revolution that came out of the countryside, was a really important part of China's trajectory, and it defined China for a generation and more. But I would say that many of the questions that China is asking today about its status in the international community and about how it's going to create domestic stability are very similar to the questions that were being asked in the 20s and 30s. The difference, of course, is that China was not then ruled by the Communist Party of today, but by its predecessor, the Nationalist Party, under its then leader, Chiang Kai-shek. And of course, for many decades, there was a fierce opposition, a fierce rivalry between Chiang Kai-shek and Chairman Mao. And that rivalry, now that both of them are long since dead, of course, has rather obscured the fact that actually the ideas of modernization, of changing society, were in some ways quite similar between the two. For instance, let's take a very contemporary question, such as China's entry into the World Trade Organization. It's almost 10 years since China came into WTO. And most people would consider this to be a question that was very much shaped by a very contemporary agenda, a post-Cold War agenda. But actually, if you look back at the 1920s and 30s, you'll see that one of the key tasks for the then nationalist Kuomintang government of Chiang Kai-shek was to what was called regain tariff autonomy. At that time, large parts of Chinese trade and even Chinese territory were controlled by foreign imperial powers: Britain, France, Japan, even the United States.
All the gates.
Exactly. Now, this didn't mean, of course, that China didn't have its own government. It did, but it was compromised in various types of sovereignty. And one of the big battles, and a battle that's often forgotten was won in the early 1930s, was for China to regain its own autonomy over tariffs, over what it could charge on imports coming into China today. Now, for those, including those in the Chinese leadership who remember that history, you can begin to understand why the WTO arguments became so sensitive. For most people in the West, WTO is very much an issue of the present decade. But of course, for those who remember a slightly longer history of a few decades in the past, they'll remember there was a time, not that far off, even with the lifetime of some older people, when China was not free to make those decisions about its own trade. And looking at what was done in that earlier Republican period can provide some of the parallels. Or let's look at the wider question that's really animating people today in terms of China's status in the international community, whether China's going to step up and really take a major role in international society as one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. Now, let's remember, why is China one of those permanent 5 members of the Security Council. It's not because of the current communist government. It is because China was one of the allied powers against the Axis, against Germany and Japan, Japan specifically, during World War II. And it's often forgotten that the reason that China reached the top table diplomatically in 1945, at the end of World War II, was because of the contribution of the nationalist government in alliance with its communist partners in fighting the Japanese. So actually, the current government of China actually has its old enemy, Chiang Kai-shek, to thank for the fact that China today, 60 years and plus later, has that seat at the top table in a way that other powers like India and Japan don't yet do so.
2 questions come up, just even as you're drawing up the scenario. The 1940 scenario was that of a wounded China trying to not even reassert itself, like maybe even stand on its own 2 feet.
Right.
The China dealing with internationalization, WTO, and all that today is a confident China. It's a China that it knows that it's got a place in world history and so on. How much of that memory do you think plays out today? And also, the other question that emerges from the scenario they're planning out is that, are you suggesting that even in modern day China, there are 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 layers of different interest groups, playing out with each other? Is there a residual Kuomintang mindset in the Chinese hierarchy today?
I don't think that the current party leadership or people in elite levels of power consciously compare themselves with the old nationalist party. I think the divisions and the historical memory of the civil war between the two is still too strong to do that. What you do find is a slow and unstated rehabilitation of some aspects of that past nationalist Kuomintang rule. To give you a specific example of that, if you go to Chongqing, which was the old wartime temporary capital of China when the Japanese had invaded, they caused, of course, great atrocities like the rape of Nanking, famously in 1937, and the government moved inland to Chongqing. Well, if you go to Chiang Kai-shek's old villa just outside Chongqing these days, it's preserved actually as a historical monument and preserved in a very positive fashion as a symbol of Chinese resistance against the Japanese during the war. And in that story, today, it doesn't matter so much if they were communists or nationalists, they were patriots fighting against the Japanese. That's the key thing. But that is a different thing from the Chinese Communist Party actually recasting itself in the mold of the old nationalists. What I think they do and what they're aware of, is seeing where the previous government had gone wrong. And of course, one of the major issues which it really had failed to solve was the economic crisis of China in the 1920s and 30s. There was a huge amount of social instability, largely caused by income inequality, by the fact that peasants couldn't make a sufficient living. And the Nationalist Party in the 20s and 30s, I think it's fair to say, failed really to deal with that problem. Even if you give them a more positive assessment, as many historians would do today, you have to say they really didn't either understand or fully deal with the nature of the problem. And that, of course, paved the way for the communist revolution of Mao. But there is also one other factor, which is a great advantage of the Communist Party of today, which the nationalists didn't have. It became clearer and clearer from the 1930s that the Japanese were going to invade China. And that factor and the eventual outbreak of World War II in East Asia from 1937 really crippled the predecessor government. However good or however bad that government was, the fact that you had a full-scale foreign invasion really made it impossible that they should succeed. And that is one of the lessons that's been learned today. If you talk to any Chinese leader or even ordinary Chinese citizens, they would generally be very keen to stress that China must retain its territorial sovereignty, that the walls, whether literal or metaphorical, around it must not be breached. And that is part of a memory of a whole series of imperialist invasions, starting with the British and the Opium Wars of the 1840s and 1860s, but going right through to the Japanese invasion of the 1930s. Having finally got their sovereignty back, first under the nationalists, then under the communists, there is no way that the current Chinese leadership are going to allow a similar situation to emerge. Fortunately, in a more peaceful world, that's a much less likely occurrence.